Hey, so we've talked about the Rhoynar, but who are the first men? Hmm? Well, they came over to Westeros over 12,000 years ago, and before that, there were no humans really in Westeros. There were humanoid creatures, the children of the forest, and giants and other magical creatures. And then the first men came over from Essos. I fucked it all up, I'm joking. But what did they do? What were they like? And what of their traditions still hold in Westeros today? Well, let's have a look. Some maesters believe that the first men originated in the grasslands of Essos, in the lands now known as the Dothraki Sea. Between 8 and 12,000 years ago, before Aegon's landing, during the Dawn Age, the first men came to Westeros from Essos, although no tale recalls exactly why they made the trek westwards. The first men crossed the land bridge, called the Arm of Dorne, under the leadership of the first king. According to legends from the north, or Garth Greenhand, the High King of the first men, according to some legends from the Reach. The first men supposedly found the sea stone chair upon the shores of Old Wick when they first came to the Iron Islands. It was the first men who named the indigenous inhabitants Children of the Forest, though the diminutive people's own name for themselves translates as those who sing the song of the earth. Their war with the Children of the Forest. The first men came with bronze swords and great leathern shields, riding horses. As the men settled in the new land, carving out holdfasts and farms, they chopped down and burned the carved weirwoods that were sacred to the gods of the Children of the Forest. This provoked wars between the children and the first men. Though the children fought with their greenseers, magic and wood dancers, the first men were larger, stronger, and more technologically advanced. The first men cut down weirwoods as they believed that the greenseers could see through the eyes of the trees. According to the old songs, the desperate children gathered the greenseers to the Isle of Faces or to Moat Cailin, a castle raised roughly 10,000 years ago by the first men. The greenseers used dark magic to shatter the Arm of Dorne with the Hammer of the Waters, creating the stepstones and the broken arm, and flooding the neck into a swamp. Although the land bridge from Essos was shattered, the greenseers failed in their efforts to halt the first men, who were already more numerous in Westeros. First men also warred against giants, who were hostile to the newcomers. The Pact. The wars against the Children of the Forest went in the first men's favour until the two sides reached a peace agreement called the Pact. On the Isle of Faces, the first men gave dominion of the deep woods to the children and promised to stop cutting down weirwoods. In return, they received claim to the rest of Westeros. Giants did not participate in the Pact. The Pact began 4,000 years of friendship and peace between the two peoples, although the children were already much diminished. The years that followed the forging of the Pact is known as the Age of Heroes. The first men eventually set aside their religion to worship the children's secret gods of the wood, and like the children, they carved faces into the weirwoods, creating heart trees. The Children of the Forest taught them to use ravens to communicate over long distances. But in those days, the birds would speak the words, and the greenseers of the children could change their skins and speak through the animals. The Long Night. During the Long Night, the first men suffered from a generation of winter, and the legendary others that are said to have invaded from the lands of Always Winter. Archmaester Fomas suggests the others were a tribe of first men instead of a monstrous enemy. Northern legends claim the last hero sought out the Children of the Forest to gain their aid. The others were driven back in the battle for the dawn, and the Night's Watch was created to keep them at bay. 6,000 or 8,000 years ago, the first men built the wall, allegedly with the aid of the children and the giants. Their language. The original language of the first men was the Old Tongue, a harsh, clanging language that is still spoken by the free folk and the giants north of the wall. The first men had a runic writing system. First men left their runes on rocks in most of the Seven Kingdoms. Only in the Stormlands, where races older than the first men were dominant, did the first men carve their tales into the trunks of trees, which have since rotted away. The meaning of the runes of the first men are disputed at the Citadel to this day. Their religion. The first men worshipped unspecified gods before they arrived in Westeros. The sister-men of the Three Sisters believed that sacred storms were the result of the Lady of the Waves mating with the Lord of the Skies. Their worship ended with the coming of the Andals, who introduced the faith of the Seven. In the Kingdom of the Storm, the sea god and his wife, the goddess of the wind, were worshipped. The Ironborn, who are considered by most to descend from the first men, worshipped the drowned god before the Andals came, and continue to do so. In addition, they also continue to believe in the drowned god's eternal enemy, the storm god. Following the pact between the first men and the children of the forest, the majority of the first men eventually set aside their own gods and adopted the gods of the children as their own. These nameless deities of stream, forest, and stone are referred to as the old gods, because the gods of the Andals, referred to as the new gods, replaced them in all but the north of Westeros. The worship of the old gods is not accompanied by priests, holy texts, songs of worship, or barely any rites. Prayers are done in silence. Worshippers of the old gods visit godswoods, groves contained within castles throughout the Seven Kingdoms, where a heart tree can be found. These trees, which have faces carved into them, are considered to be sacred. Worshippers believe the old gods watch through the trees. The heart trees are usually weirwoods, and godswoods are often the only places where living weirwoods still remain. That's until you get north of the wall anyway. Once, all noble houses had a godswood with a heart tree in its centre, but the first men, in their wars against the children of the forest, cut down many of the trees, as did the Andals later on, replacing the old gods with the seven in the southern kingdoms. According to Maester Yorick, blood sacrifice to the old gods was still practiced in the vicinity of White Harbour only 500 years ago. Their social hierarchy. The exact laws of inheritance followed by the first men have not been stated. Several of the groups that descended from the first men practiced rule by consensus, or election amongst several lords and chieftains in council. The Ironborn of old chose their kings through a king's moot, where each man who owned and captained a ship might cast a vote for a new king. In Dorne, before the coming of the Andals or the Rhoynar, the first men divided into numerous petty kingdoms. The High Kings of Dorne, who ruled the lands near the mouth of the Greenblood, were elected in a non-hereditary fashion from among a dozen noble families. This practice eventually collapsed when a dispute concerning an election set the families to war against one another. The free folk who live beyond the wall are led by chieftains. At several times during history, they have united behind a non-hereditary. The Vale Mountain clans are led by chieftains as well. In council, they insist that every man or woman must be allowed to have their voice heard. According to Archmaester Euron, the ancient marsh kings of the Crannogman of the Neck were considered to be a first among equals, often thought to be touched by the old gods. Thraldom was a common practice amongst the first men before the arrival of the Andals. The first night was a custom in which the warlords and heroes slept with maidens on their wedding night. Pregnancies were seen by some as a blessing, as the new husbands could raise the children of the heroes as their own. Their military. The first men wielded bronze swords and great bronze axes. They were armoured in bronze as well, carrying large leather shields. When the coming of the Andals began, the first men still fought in bronze. In time, however, Andal blacksmiths taught the first men to arm and armour themselves in iron. The first men rode horses into battle. Although not a seafaring people, The first men did use fishing boats and trading cogs, though these were no match for long ships with great sails and banks of oars. Their architecture and infrastructure. When the first men settled in Westeros, they cut down the forests, began to plough the fields, and constructed roads through the hill country. The farms and villages the first men built were protected by stout motte and bailey forts, which were later on replaced by stone castles. The first men also raised up ring forts, ruins of which can still be found at numerous places, including the Fist of the First Men and Seal Rock at White Harbour, and the Stormlands. On Sea Dragon Point still stands the ruins of an ancient stronghold of the First Men. The First Men, and later on the early Andals, built square towers and keeps. In the Reach, Andal stonemasons taught the First Men how to further strengthen and defend their castles and holdfasts. Some of the barrow fields contain monuments. Guest right. The custom of guest right is both a sacred rule and an ancient one. The guest rights are taken seriously both beyond the wall and in the Seven Kingdoms, and although it looms less in the southern kingdoms, it is held most dear in the north. There, breaking guest right is punished similarly to the dearest of treasons. The most common way of receiving guest right is by eating bread and salt. Once guest right has been offered and accepted, the guests and hosts are protected from harm by one another for the length of the stay. Guest gifts can be given on the day the guests depart, possibly as a means of ending the protection of guest right. Guest gifts are no longer given by all lords, however. Death. The first men believed that the person who condemned another to die should be the one who wields the sword. House Stark practices this belief still. The first men interned their dead in barrows, which can be found everywhere in the north. For example, the Great Barrow of Barrowton, where the first king of the first men is said to have been buried. The Barrowlands contains wide plains of flatness which are relieved by long, low hummocks, the barrows of the first men. The Starks bury their deceased family members in the crypts of Winterfell, located beneath the castle. The Boltons similarly bury their deceased beneath the Dreadfort. The Blackwoods, originally from the north, bury their dead beneath the weirwood of Raventree. The Tullys of Riverrun, a house of the first men origin who now followed the faith of the Seven, place their dead in a ship on the Red Fork and have it sink into the river after being set ablaze with fire arrows. Their legacy. According to George R.R. Martin, hardly any Westerosi are pure Andal or First Man after thousands of years of interbreeding. While much of their culture was lost over the millennia, the people of the North retained the spirit of the First Men, and many are proud of carrying the blood of the First Men in their veins, such as the Starks and the Karstarks. South of the Neck, there have been people that still proudly claim the blood of the First Men, such as the Blackwoods and the Brackens, the Danes, the Redfort, the Royces, the Strongs, the Westerlings, and the people of Crackclaw Point. Lord Jon Royce possesses a suit of bronze, rune-covered armour, dating back thousands of years. The Vale Mountain clans of the Mountains of the Moon are descendants of the First Men. During Aegon's conquest, Aegon Targaryen I was proclaimed King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men by the High Septon in Old Town, and Aegon's successors on the Iron Throne have continued the usage. Since the Seven Kingdoms continued to have inconsistent laws by the time of King Jaehaerys Targaryen I, including some places following ancient laws of the First Men, Septon Barth began unifying the Great Code in 55 AC, after conquest. Barth and Queen Alysanne Targaryen ended the practice of the First Night, considering it an antiquated practice of the First Men of old. Beyond the wall, the Thenns consider themselves the last of the First Men. So what did you make of the First Men? Tell me, what are your thoughts on them? Don't forget to like and subscribe and, all of that. I'll see you next time, okay? Cheerio.